So I've opened up After Effects and I've created a new composition, and I've set my width and height to 650 by 650 pixels, and my duration is 2 seconds. And I'm not going to worry right now about my background color because I'm going to insert a new background. So we'll go ahead and leave that black, it doesn't really matter, and then I'll click OK. All right, so as I said, I want to create a background that is not the background color, the default background color of the composition. And so I'm going to go up to Layer, New, and Solid. Maybe something like this. All right, so, and then I'm going to rename that, and I could have done that when I created the layer, but I can also do it here. So Deep Orange Solid, I'm going to, in the timeline, name that Background 1. And I'll go ahead and lock that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create my second chapter. So Composition, New Composition, and I will call this one Chapter 2. And it has remembered my settings, so I don't need to change anything. It's 650 by 650, 2 seconds long. All right, and click OK. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So Layer, New, Solid. And this one, I'll make a different color. In this case, maybe a light blue. And as I said before, I could rename the solid in the solid settings, which I'll go ahead and do that. And so I'll call this Background 2 and click OK, and then lock that. All right, and then once again, I'll come up to New Composition or Command N, and I will call this Chapter 3. Again, 650 by 650 pixels, duration 2 seconds. Okay, and one last time, Layer, New, Solid, or Command Y. And I will call this Background 3 and change the color to something green. There is one other composition I want to add, and that will be the master composition that all these compositions live within. So I'll go Composition, New Composition, and I will change the duration for that to 600. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is drag and drop each of these compositions into the timeline and just stagger them out a little bit. All right. And I'll go ahead and call this composition in the project panel. I'll go ahead and control click and rename and call this master. And if I play the master composition back, the one with Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, all you're really seeing right now is a shift of colors, right? So with this instructional GIF, what I have done is I've just built the foundation for the instructional GIF that we're going to create. And so part of what we're going to talk a little bit about with this instructional GIF is the idea of workflow. And so one thing that I recommend is not focusing on this 1 second or this 10 frames and then moving on and going to the next 10 frames and finishing that and then moving on to the next 10 frames and so on. If you are able to, I would go ahead and lay the foundation and then little by little through multiple passes, refine further and further each section, right? So you're not focusing on one minute section and finishing that before you move on to the next section. Now we're going to go ahead and take those assets that we created in Illustrator into After Effects. So I'm not going to talk so much about the second and third chapters, since a lot of the same principles that we'll be applying for this first chapter apply to the other two. So we're looking at the animation, the finished animation for the first chapter. I want to show you that on a loop before we go ahead and start from scratch. All right, so I'll go ahead and shift select and delete all the layers except for the background, which you remember we locked. And I'm going to go ahead and first of all drag my assets into the composition. So the hand, and make sure that that is above the background, as well as the seed layer. You'll notice that the sizes, of course, are considerably different. And so the first thing I'm going to do is S for scale on the seed and just scale that down a little bit. And I might need to rescale this once I get a better sense of the size of the hand. And then I will do the same with the hand, scale that up a little bit, maybe right around there. So for me, it's about 175, 176, somewhere around there. Don't forget that when we scale something higher than 100%, it's important to continuously rasterize, right? So remember, in the switches portion of the timeline, click the continuously rasterize. Something else I wanted to point out though is that if you look at the edges of the hand, yes, they are more crisp than when continuously rasterize is not selected, but they are a little bit ratty. And the reason why has nothing to do with the scale of the object. It actually has to do with the zoom in on the composition, right? So if I look down here, I'm at 187%. So that's why, is that my preview is zoomed higher than 100%. It has nothing to do with the file itself. And the seed, I don't really need to continuously rasterize that. I might scale it down a little bit. Maybe it looks like 10% or so. And then temporarily position that right here. And I might actually end up moving the hand and the seed down just a little bit more to make room for that text. All right, so you'll remember that we created everything purposely just in black in Illustrator, and in After Effects, as I had mentioned, we're going to tint those assets. So once again, if you don't remember where tint is, you can always go to the Help menu and type in tint. And it just so happens to be within the color correction menu. And then there it is down there. So we'll select that. And then in my Effects tab, I have my tint effect, and it says Map Black to Map White to. And there's no white in the image, so I don't need to map white to anything, but I need to map black to kind of a light or medium brown, right? So we're basically saying we want to change black to medium brown. So I'll go ahead and click on that swatch, and you can choose brown, a shade of brown that you like, or a shade of any color you like from your color picker. I've gone ahead down here to where my hex code is, and I found a specific shade of brown. I'm just going to enter that into my hex code. Once we have tinted one object the way we like it, as I have done this seed, you can Command C to copy that tint effect and move to the other asset, select that, and Command V. All right, so now I have my hand and my seed tinted the same shade of brown. So let's add a little bit of animation to this. I'm going to temporarily hide my seed because I don't want that to be distracting. And you'll notice from the animation that I had before, the hand had a little bend to it as the wrist dips down and drops the seed. So the way that we employ that animation is through something called the puppet pin tool. And that's this last tool in your toolbar in After Effects. So I select that, and then I'm going to go over directly to the hand. I want to make sure that the hand layer is selected. So I go to the hand with the arm, and I'm first going to start out in the arm area, not off screen completely, but just to the edge of the frame. And I'll click, and it adds a puppet pin right there. Next, I'll go to the wrist, and I'll add 2 puppet pins, one on the top and one on the bottom. And then I'll go toward this top knuckle over here and add a pin there. So basically, we're allowing a situation where we can move this pin around and it will bend at the wrist. All right, I'll go back to my selection tool, and you'll notice in your timeline, in your effects drop down from the hand layer, you have your tint filter, you have your tint effect, and then we now have the puppet. So I'm going to dial down on this menu a little bit so you can see there's my puppet effect. And then if I click the disclosure arrow for mesh 1, that gives me these 3 options. With deform at the bottom, I'm going to click on the disclosure for that. And then shift select puppet pins 1 through 4, click on the little disclosure arrows for those. And you can see that we have 4 keyframes, and I'll go ahead and highlight those. And so what I could do actually is I could click and drag, since all those keyframes are selected, I could click and drag all those keyframes down the timeline if I want that wrist bend to happen a little bit later. All right, so I want the wrist to return to the same position at the end that it was in the beginning. So I can also Command C with all these keyframes selected, copy all those keyframes, Command C, and then bring my playhead to the end of the timeline and Command V to paste those. All right, and then I'll just go about midway through, maybe about a second or so, and I can click off of all the keyframes so that I have these hollow yellow circles. And really all I need to do, I don't know that I'll need to adjust these other keyframes, but I am going to take this knuckle here and just drop it down a little bit. You got to kind of watch out a little bit. You can see it's getting a little funky there, right? So you don't want to stretch the hand too far. It gets a little unnatural. Something else that's happening, if you look at the left edge of your frame, now I have turned the hand into rubber here, but there's a little gap where the arm ends. So you want to try to avoid that as well. Figure out how far you can take that hand down. And less is more. It doesn't need to be tons. Again, you don't want to distort that hand and arm either. So I'm just going to play that back and see how that looks. Really simple animation. And really what it did is it just created a mid keyframe on only that puppet pin 4, that knuckle. And once again, I can click and drag to slide these keyframes down if I want to readjust the timing and this kind of thing. All right, so now that I have that, I can make my seed visible again. And I can figure out where it is that the hand started dipping down. So maybe about right there. And then I'll bring the seed up to meet that little pinched part of the fingers. And this time I'm going to use my position parameter. So I have the seed selected and then P for position, create a position keyframe, and the seed is just going to drop down. And I might even bring it down a little bit toward the right as well. And if I zoom in a little bit on that, I can see that my seed, it's kind of hard to see, but my seed has some little Bezier curves. It's easier to see this one up here. And I can even add a little curve if I want, so that maybe the drop of the seed is a little bit more naturalistic. I'll just preview that. Something else that I wanted to point out too is the graph editor. Right, so the seed, it's still in the fingers here. And so we're going to account for gravity in this case, right? So I will select that keyframe right before the seed leaves the fingers. And then this icon right here that has this sort of S curve is the graph editor icon. If I click on that, I go into a completely different timeline. This graph here refers to velocity, right? And it's measured in pixels. So I have my units right now as I'm zoomed in are 0, 50, 100, and 150 pixels per second. So basically the more that this line is higher, the faster the object will travel. The lower the line is, the slower the object will travel. So I'm just going to click and drag on this keyframe and drag it down to 0, because what we want to happen is we want that seed to kind of gain speed as it drops, just like it would realistically. And then I might drag this end keyframe up a little bit and adjust its Bezier curve. And you'll have to it's going to be some trial and error. You can see that this is still a little weird, so I'm going to undo those just so we're back. I want to also talk about some of these default ways to adjust velocity. So right now at the bottom of the timeline, I have easy ease and easy ease in and easy ease out. So what I did is I selected the first keyframe and I applied the easy ease, and then I get this nice gradual curve. So if I play that back, right, so that looks a little bit more naturalistic. I'll go back to the main timeline here. So I exit out of the graph editor by clicking on the graph editor icon, and then I'm back here. And you can see that this keyframe indicates that there is a change in velocity, right? So we have our diamond keyframe, which indicates no change in velocity, and then we have this one that does. Okay, so the last stage of this panel is to apply text. So I'll go up here to my text tool, and we have the option for horizontal or vertical text, and I've chosen horizontal text, and I just type in 1 plant seeds, and then I'll move that back over and center it as I like it. And as far as the color, what I can do is go over to my character panel. Now, you should have your character panel available to you just by clicking on the text tool. If for some reason the character panel is not there, you can always go to Window and make sure that Character Panel is checked. As far as font color, I have this eyedropper tool and I have my fill color selected, not the stroke. I've decided not to have a stroke with this text, but I choose my fill color eyedropper and I just click on the arm so that I can select that same shade of brown. And the rest of the text options I won't talk about because some of this is going to be second nature for you just by the nature of working in a Word doc or something like that. Like you have your font size, you have your stroke size if you do have a stroke, and so on. What I would like to talk about are the character animators that allow us to make the text more dynamic by adding animation. So I go down to my timeline, and I click the disclosure arrow for the text layer plant seeds. And then right across from the text is animate. So the first character animator I will choose is an opacity character animator. And once I do that, I get this animator 1. And I'm going to click on animator 1, press return, and title that opacity animator. And I don't have to do this, it's not necessary. I just like to, so that it keeps things a little bit more organized and more easy to identify. So if you look below the disclosure for opacity animator, we have range selector 1, and then we have this opacity parameter. And I'm going to change that to 0. Because what we want is we want the opacity to start at 0%. In other words, not be visible. Where you will be adding keyframes, though, is in this range selector 1. So make sure that you click the disclosure arrow for that. And we're going to be creating keyframes for the start parameter for range selector 1. So with my playhead at the beginning of the timeline, I click the stopwatch for start, and then I'll go to about 18 frames, and I will dial that percentage up to 100. So basically I'm telling After Effects I want you to start at 0 visibility, and then I want you to dial that up. And you'll notice that the letters are coming in one at a time. You do have the option to go into the advanced menu, and rather than based on characters or letters, you can choose words or lines. However, it makes sense for us to go based on characters, so we won't actually change that. All right, and then I'll just play that on a loop. Okay, good. So we are done with the first panel. Now, I don't want to spend too much time going through every step of the second and third chapters, since a lot of the principles that we applied to the first chapter will be principles that we also apply to the second and third chapters. But I do want to look over them with you so that you get a sense of how it all works. So I'll play the second chapter on a loop. Right? So one thing that I found useful is that you'll notice that the color of the watering pail does match the background to a good degree. It's a little darker, of course. And so sometimes something that helps me when I go to my tint, which remember what we did for each of these assets is we applied a tint to it, which once again, you can just type in tint and there it is, right? But one thing that helped me was to get my eyedropper tool and just click first on the background. And then that was a good starting place. So from there, I could make things a little bit darker and I could get something closer. As far as the text, we also added another character animator. This one was the position animator, right? So if I go over to the add, there's a lot of options that I have here. We went with opacity last time. This time I'm going with position. And once again, we start with the position. I'll just close the range selector for a moment. And then if we look at the position, we first determine what we want the position to be. So in this case, if you look at the top of the frame, I'll just tweak it a little bit. So what I did is I actually moved that water daily completely off the screen from above. And then I went in here into the range selector. And just like I did with the opacity, I start at 0%. And then by about 18, 24, 26 frames, I take that up to 100%. And then what that results in is it looks like the letters are raining down, right? So at 0%, we're in that initial position that I specified in the position animator. And by the end, we are where the text originally was before I applied the animator. All right, and then as far as the watering pail, one thing that I would like us to look at is the animation itself is fairly simple in terms of if I open the rotation parameter, what we can see happening is that a couple of rotation keyframes have been placed. And you can tell by looking at the keyframes themselves that this has some ease to it, right? So there is a change in velocity so that we start out slow in the rotation, gain speed, and I can even go into the graph editor so you can see this, right? So once again, when we're looking at the 0 horizontal line, we're looking at basically no motion at all. And so our watering pail slowly picks up speed until it gets to the top, and then it starts slowing down again, with the middle of the curve being the fastest. We'll go back. So yeah, so what we're looking at is a couple of rotation keyframes. But the thing I wanted you to notice about this, look at where that anchor point is, right? It's right here. And if I want to move the anchor point, I can go up here to this pan behind tool in my toolbar, and I can move that anchor point wherever I like. So this wouldn't have good results, I don't think, but I'm going to move it to the head of the spout just to see what happens. Well, I guess that could be another way to make it work, right? But now the position is off. But you get the idea here. I'll move it to the top just to show you another. Keep that in mind, that when you want to rotate something, think about where you want that rotation to happen from, and that is through the pan behind tool. Okay, finally, at the end, you see these little water droplets come out. Now, those shapes may seem familiar because they're actually the seeds. And I left them titled seed, but I could, if I wanted to, call this water drop 1, water drop 2, water drop 3, and so on. So we're looking at the seeds, and what I did in this case is rather than animate 3 different seeds, I took the same seed, and I'll just delete these 2 other seeds to give you a sense, right? So all we're looking at is this one seed. So the one thing I did is I cut the layer. So that's Shift-Command-D, and I got rid of everything that happened before that layer because the water drop doesn't really need to come in until the watering pail goes down, right? So I essentially took this layer and I Command-D, so remember Shift-Command-D cuts a layer wherever the playhead is. Command-D duplicates. And all I did is I slid this duplicate layer about 5 or 6 frames down and then go Command-D again and once again slide that layer about 5 or 6 frames down. And that way all you have to do is animate the one seed and the same, you're getting the same animation, right? So you don't have to do it 3 times. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. Now chapter 3 gets a little bit trickier, right? And that's this one where we're looking at the plant grow. In order to discuss this, I actually have to go into this plant composition. So this is the only chapter where I actually nested a composition within the chapter composition. So let's go ahead and look at the plant composition first. So if you missed that, what I did is I double-clicked on the plant composition. And I'll take this playhead for now to the end. When I imported this, the boundary of the artwork was like really snugly fit to the plant itself. So I had to actually expand the boundaries of the composition. So remember that you can always go composition and composition settings, and you can change these settings. And let's say I change this to 1000. Right? You see it's made it a bit wider. I'm going to undo that. The other thing that you'll remember from the first tutorial for the instructional GIF animation is that we had the stalk and we had the leaves on different layers in Illustrator. right? So that's going to give us an opportunity to independently animate these shapes, which if I scrub this back pretty slowly, you can see that a lot is happening here. So one thing that's happening is I have applied the puppet tool to get this funky little shape here to allow the plant to gradually grow. And I've clicked on mesh so that you can see those hollow yellow circles a little bit more clearly. So here's my starting position and ending position. And really what made it easier is, since I knew this is where I wanted things to end, I took my playhead to frame 18, where I knew that I wanted the plant to be fully grown. I put my puppet pins there, which created keyframes there. And then I took my playhead to the beginning of the timeline, and that's where I distorted these puppet pins. And so you get this growing. And then as far as the leaves themselves, I wanted the leaves to scale up, right? So they start at 0%. If I look at the timeline, I can see I'm at 0%. So it starts at 0% and then it grows to 100. I'll use my pan behind tool and I'll move my anchor point to the other side of the leaf, the pointy part, right? So that doesn't look right. Right, so that's why it's important to have the anchor point right there, really close to the stalk. All right, and then my other leaf grows and the third leaf grows. What I did is I copied the scale keyframes, which is just 0%, and then about 6 frames later, 100%, same here for all leaves. So I copied the scale parameter, but I did need to position the anchor point. Again, that was pan behind tool and then move the anchor point. I needed to position the anchor point at the part of the leaf that was closest to the stem. And so you get this animation. Now, the reason why I had to create this composition in and of itself and not have it live within the chapter 3 composition is because if we look at the scale parameter for the composition plant, and I'm back in chapter 3, of course, we start at 0 and then we go up to about 69%. And my anchor point, if you'll notice, is right down here. So basically what I'm doing is I'm scaling up this entire composition. And then as far as the text, it goes really quickly, but the letters are actually growing individually. So let's look at that character animator, that text animator. And so like I've done with the other two, I will highlight animator 1 and I will call that scale animator. So just like I did with the other two text animators, I set that parameter to 0. And then we can look inside the range selector and we start at 0. In this case, we start at 0 at 18 frames and then we end at 100%. And the letters grow so quickly that it's kind of hard to see this. I'll spread out the keyframe a little bit more just so we can see those letters grow. So I'm scrubbing across this text. All right, I'll go ahead and return that keyframe. So now I'll look at the master to see the result of my work. All right, so there you have it, instructional GIF. So something else that might be useful is if you feel that this text is going by too quickly and your reader would not have enough time to read the text, there's an easy fix to this. And just like we've nested chapter 1, 2, and 3 compositions inside the master, we could click and drag master into another composition, right? So what I did is in my project window, I click and drag master down to the composition icon, and I get something called master 2, and I can leave it at that name. And I'm going to go to my stretch factor. Again, if you don't have a stretch factor, you can control click on this gray bar right here, and where it says columns, just make sure that you have stretch selected. So I could say, well, I want this to be a little slower. So in After Effects, anything higher than 100% is slower. Anything lower is faster. And I could say, well, what would happen if I got this to play at 150%, which is 9 seconds, right? Well, the problem is now that since I made my composition longer, my GIF gets cut off. So all I have to do though is go up to composition and composition settings and remember that animation was 9 seconds. So I'll change my composition to 9 seconds. And now we should get all of it. So once you get to the end of your instructional GIF, make sure that people can read it, that they have enough time to absorb the text. And it is good that, you know, this is a GIF, and so if they miss something the first time, they can catch it again and again and again and again and again. Still, you don't want to have that text happen too fast. And this is kind of a really quick and easy way to do it. Of course, you could also get into each of these chapters and individually tweak the keyframes so that maybe your text stays on screen a little bit longer or this kind of thing. All right, so we are at the end of our instructional GIF tutorial, and now let's export that just as we have done in the past.